Hello Bookbellas and fellas, Kira here, and today I'm going to be discussing all the books that I read in October. I actually had a really good reading month. I read 12 books this month, and I actually liked most of them that I read. I didn't really have a ton of complaints regarding them in general, but I just want to go ahead and get right into it because I have 12 books to talk about. So the first book that I have to talk about is We Are Okay by Nina LaCour. This book was super short. It was only about 256 pages, so that's really not a lot, and it didn't take me that long to get through either. The entire story is told from the perspective of Marin, and it's told from two different timelines. I don't have the actual book with me because I read it on my Kindle, and I'm going to leave a link for that book down below for the Amazon website. I am not an Amazon affiliate, but just so that you guys can get a visual if you want. This whole book is told from the perspective of Marin. Marin is this girl who has experienced a ton of grief in her life, and it's actually told from two different timelines. The first timeline is when she's in high school with her friends living with her grandfather after she's already lost her mother, and it's like everybody knows about her mother during this time. She goes to the beach. I guess her mother was big into surfing, but she doesn't really know anything concrete about her mother, in spite of the fact that her grandfather is her mother's father. And then the other timeline that we have is the one where it's her first semester at college, and she moved away to go to university, and she's still full of grief, and she's still dealing with a lot of stuff on her mind. And her friend Mabel, who's from high school, is coming to talk to her. Well, they kind of allude to the fact that her and Mabel were really close in high school, and Mabel was pretty much her best friend. Well, in the present timeline for the college, she's grieving because I guess something happened with her grandfather, and everything has just kind of fallen apart on her. She's having to get used to being a new person and having a new identity and having to recognize herself as somebody who doesn't have any family connections around her. So she's kind of just gone out on her own, and she's become like this person that's isolated herself from the rest of the world. This book was so beautiful. This book had so many different things in it that were just so well constructed, and I really loved how deeply it dug into grief and captured it so perfectly. And my biggest complaint I think I had about the book was the pacing, and it was just a very slow pacing because it doesn't really feel like a ton of stuff happens, but it feels like in those spaces where not a lot of stuff is happening, there's a lot of emotional stuff going on underneath everything. And so I did feel emotionally connected to the characters and to Marin because everything that she's gone through was just so heart-wrenching. I felt like this author captured what it was to be grieving and having to identify as a new human being after everything has been taken away from you. I ended up rating this book a 4 out of 5 stars. Once again, this book was rated a 4 out of 5 stars because of the pacing being a bit slow. The next book that I read is An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. This has been buzzing everywhere. I really enjoyed this. This is about a girl named April who was walking home by herself one morning about 3 o'clock in the morning in New York City, and she is going through an intersection. She looks up and she sees this giant statue of a samurai that she ends up calling Carl. She calls her friend and she says, "Hey, you got to get over here. We got to film this right now." Her friend has a YouTube channel, and so her friend shows up and he records everything. He puts it on his Facebook page and it ends up going viral. This book was really well constructed. I loved it so much. It really opened up your mind about fame and the realities of fame. And Hank Green actually has in here 5 different levels of fame. The lowest being, that you're locally famous, there's, a few people know about you, you're popular in your small circle, and, you're famous in your small circle. And it goes all the way up to the 5th tier where you're a household name and everybody knows about you and you can't go outside without being noticed. And this really just dives into what fame is about, and it dives into everything that has to do with fame and being adjusted to it emotionally and mentally and having to promote yourself and deal with everything that comes along with it. I really loved this book. It was such an interesting read. My biggest complaint about this book was the fact that it had kind of an ambiguous ending, which I guess it wasn't so ambiguous that it couldn't have stood on its own, but I wanted a little bit more from the ending. Now, I didn't know at that point that they were coming out with a sequel, but I still stand by my 4.5 stars because of that little hiccup that I had with the ending being a bit ambiguous. This is actually classified as a scientific contemporary, and it really delivers because, Carl is kind of seen like it's this alien, and, nobody knows anything about him. He doesn't speak, he doesn't move, and there are a bunch of other statues that have appeared all over the world just like him. I have a more in-depth review if you want to watch it. I'm going to leave a link for you to watch the more in-depth review that I made for this, because this book was wonderful and I really do recommend it. The next book that I have to talk about is Strange Grace by Tessa Gratton. This was a phenomenal book also. I really did like this one as well. This actually takes place in what they call Three Graces, which is a town that was built upon grace witches who made a bargain with the devil in the forest about 200, 300 years ago, somewhere around there. And what the bargain was is that every 7 years they would sacrifice somebody from the village and nobody would get sick. The crops would be wonderful. Like, there would be nothing wrong with the crops. Nobody would die of anything but natural causes. During the initial portion of this book, they're getting ready to send somebody into the forest to spend the night out in the devil's forest to become either a sacrifice, and if he survives, he will be let go and come back to Three Graces. This book is told from 3 different perspectives. You have Marwen, who is actually the daughter of a grace witch, and the grace witch, helps to conduct like all of the ceremonies and all the rites before they send somebody in the forest, and definitely a position of respect. Then you have Arthur, who's dealing a lot with who he is as a person, because when he was a kid, being the fact that they only send boys into the forest, his mother decided to dress him as a girl. For the longest time, Arthur grew up thinking that he was a girl named Lynn, and he thought that he was fitting in like with all the girls, just to realize that one day during a dip in the pond where they were all nude, that he didn't have the same equipment as everybody else. So he was definitely trying to figure out who he was as a person, and he goes through quite a bit of identity, but he's also very angry. He's a very angry person because he feels very much on the outside, I think. And then you have Run, who is this good old boy. Everybody loves him. He is just, looked on as being like the perfect boy, like, the all-star. Of course, everybody looks at him and knows that he's probably going to be the next person like that's going to be brought into the forest to spend the night out there in the devil's forest. Initially, when they send that person into the forest, they wait up all night and then they see that he comes out, but he's missing a hand, and they think that there's something wrong because he didn't quite survive, but he didn't quite get out fully intact either. But they feel that the bargain has been met because they at least sent somebody out and gave the devil in the devil's forest a chance to take this person. 3.5 years later, something starts happening. People start getting sick. Somebody with a baby ends up giving birth prematurely, which is not supposed to happen. Some of the crops are diseased, and people are getting coughs. So they're all trying to figure out what's going on. This was a YA fantasy, and it was very intriguing. Like, I've never read anything like it before, and it was very different. So I did appreciate all the variety in it. Now, there was a love triangle in here, almost like a love circle. It was a polyamorous relationship, and I really appreciated the fact that they had representation for the polyamorous relationship. It's just, I don't feel like there was enough declaration of love and emotion for this. So I wasn't quite happy with that aspect. I wanted a little bit more. Like, if they were going to include the romance, I kind of wanted a little bit more conversation about the romance. Overall, though, the author did a really good job of balancing both the aspects of the fantasy and the aspects of the romance in this book. And actually, at the end, there wasn't really any questions left. She sewed up everything, every loose end pretty well. So I ended up rating this book a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read was What If It's Us by Becky Albertalli and Adam Silvera. This book takes place in New York City. You have Arthur, and he is coming to New York for the summer to be an intern at his mother's law firm to add more to his college resume. And then you have Ben, who just got out of a relationship, and he is native to New York. One day during an errand, Arthur decides to go into the post office because he sees Ben with a package going to the post office himself, and is so smitten by Ben that he decides to go in and try to talk to this boy. Well, they make a connection, and they definitely have a good thing going on together, the short conversation that they had. But then out of nowhere, a flash mob breaks out in the middle of the post office, and they get separated. Ben had gotten Arthur's name, but Arthur never got Ben's name, so they really didn't have a ton to go on as far as trying to find each other, but they looked everywhere. So the first 150 pages of this book was actually devoted to them just trying to find each other, and then the rest was devoted to the interaction and everything. And I really enjoyed this book, but I didn't enjoy it quite as much as a couple of other books that I read by these authors. I loved Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli, and I absolutely loved They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera. They both had a lot of depth. They both like kind of, they weren't just surface level fluffiness. And I felt like this had a lot of surface level fluffiness. Now, if you are into fluffy contemporaries that are just purely fluff and, just like a lot of like interaction and everything else like that, this book is definitely for you. But I can honestly say that this book was not for me because it lacked those elements of going a little bit deeper. And I really wanted just a little bit more from this. I ended up rating this a 3.5 out of 5 stars just because I didn't feel a ton happened in this book. And I felt like, while I enjoyed a lot of the interaction, I really wanted more from this because this was definitely one of my most anticipated reads. And if you want to hear more about that, I have a non-spoilery review for this book also, which I'm going to leave a link for. The next book that I read is A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness and illustrated by Jim Kay. This was a book that I was trying to get to last year, and I actually read this for the Spookathon, which I completed, by the way, and I'm very excited about that. I completed all 3 books that I wanted to get to, and I did it in a timely manner, and I had a really good time reading for that readathon. It was my first completed readathon, so very exciting, but this was one of the books that I read for that. This book is about a little boy named Connor who is dealing with a lot in his life. He's made fun of at school. He doesn't really get along with too many people there, and he's kind of dealing with a pity party at school because the teachers are going easier on him, nobody punishes him because his mother's at home sick. Connor's convinced that his mother is going to get better. She keeps saying that she's on a new treatment and that everything is going to get better and that she's going to get through this, and Connor believes her because he doesn't want to believe anything else. And she's struggling very much with being sick, and she doesn't seem like she's getting much better at all. So in a lot of ways, she's a little bit dependent on Connor as well. Well, one day this tree appears outside of their yard. The mother keeps remarking upon the tree, and one night this tree turns into a monster who requires that he tell Connor 3 stories, and at the end Connor is required to tell him 1. This book was such a wonderful read. I've heard so much about it, and it blew me away. It was definitely emotional, and it was definitely heartbreaking. Tied things up so perfectly at the end, and I really, really love this. I ended up giving this a 5 out of 5 stars. So the next book that I read for the Spookathon was Sadie by Courtney Summers. This is a YA thriller. This book is told from 2 different perspectives. One's a podcast, the other one is from Sadie's perspective. Sadie is a girl who is very, very upset. Her younger sister Maddie was murdered, and so she goes and she buys a car and she goes out on the road trying to find her sister's murderer. When we're in the perspective of Sadie, Sadie really only gives us details regarding what's presently happening to her, and there's a few flashbacks, but nothing super intense. All of our background information comes from the podcast and speculation coming from what people think happened and what is happening, and people that Sadie knew along the way of her journey. Sometimes you encountered people that she met during her journey. So you really got a very interesting, rounded perspective of what was going on, and I really liked the layout of it, because the podcast made this book very unique, because it almost was it left what was going on up to the person who was listening to the podcast, because if this was a real podcast, you would only know so much. But because we also had Sadie's perspective, you knew what was presently happening. And it was almost like you were having 2 alternating viewpoints that were vastly different, but that really added to the story. This was also a very deep book, and it had a lot of very interesting reflections from Sadie herself that made it very personal, and I really felt a lot for Sadie. I ended up giving this book a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Once again, it had an ambiguous ending that left me wanting more. It left me wanting to know what else was going to happen in the story. And I know in real life, the way it ended, it probably very realistic, but I still have so many questions, and I'm really upset that I didn't get all of those questions answered. But don't let that deter you from reading the book, because this is definitely worth the read. The last book that I read for the Spookathon was The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein by Kirsten White. This is told from Elizabeth Frankenstein's perspective. Elizabeth Frankenstein was a girl that Victor grew up with, and she was actually a ward to the Frankensteins, and was brought in to help socialize Victor. Victor was a very socially awkward boy as a kid, very morbid. He was always, doing morbid things. And so Elizabeth was there to help him socialize himself. And she herself starts out the book being very sinister, and it is a perfect match for Frankenstein himself. This book was very reminiscent of old style writing. It's what I would imagine the original to be. I haven't read the original yet, but I've seen enough and I'm familiar enough with the story and all the details that I felt like I could interpret this, and I was right. If you've watched Mary Shelley's Frankenstein with Robert De Niro, that one was perfect as far as, like the overall storyline and getting the gist of it. So if you want to devour it quickly, there is a movie. Of course, like that's very taboo on book 2, but whatever. I liked the movie. Robert De Niro was the Frankenstein's monster, and it was really good. But this actually offered just enough information to make this very interesting and unique, and it was wonderful. And I ended up giving this a 5 out of 5 stars because I loved it so much, and I honestly feel like this is going to be one of my all-time favorites because I really enjoyed it. I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about it, but I ended up loving it. The next book that I read was Damsel by Elena K. Arnold. This book is considered a YA fantasy, and I'm not really sure why, other than the fact that they kind of sugarcoat everything. But if you don't understand what they're sugarcoating, I don't know how you're going to get a ton out of this book anyway. So a lot of what they sugarcoat is references to erections, and they make a reference to syphilis. And I mean, if you don't understand what's going on, you're going to be lost. So I don't really see how this makes a great YA book, but that didn't stop me from loving it because I felt because I caught on to everything that was going on, I absolutely loved it. This almost has a Sleeping Beauty type retelling to it, in which Prince Emery is one of our main characters, and he decides to scale a castle to do what his father did to become king, and that is to slay a dragon and bring home a damsel. His mother is actually a damsel, so there's kind of a pattern here, but he decides to go up and take her from the tower. This book is a statement book. This is definitely a feminist read. I felt so angsty the whole time reading this because he does rescue the damsel, and he names her Amma because she doesn't remember anything from before the castle. This book is full of angst, but I liked it because I felt bad for her a lot of the time, but I felt like it helped me to bond over that, which is kind of an odd thing. But I loved the statements that this made, and it made a really strong statement about how even if he's nice at face value, he still treated her like a piece of property. I'm planning on doing an in-depth review for this because I have quite a bit to talk about as far as overall interlacing feminist things and the things that he does to her. But I loved this book. I ended up rating it a 4.5 out of 5 stars because I loved the statements it made, and I loved how strongly feminine it was, and the ending was phenomenal. It could not have ended better. The next book that I read, I was actually sent for an honest review. It's called Pulse by Vino Vanitas and illustrated by Antidote. This book had such beautiful illustrations in it, and I really loved it, and it was an ebook, so I'm going to leave the link in the bottom for you just in case you want to check it out for the Amazon link, because that's where I read it at, and I really enjoyed this. It's actually a short poetry book, and it has artwork in it that kind of goes along with the poetry, and it really felt like the poetry was this letter that the author was writing to the reader to give them hope, to tell them everything was going to be okay, and also to impart words of wisdom to them. And I really liked that perspective that I got from that. There was even one in there about how people look at your hair and they stereotype you by the person that you are based on your hair, and I thought that made a great statement because people look at your hair and then they think automatically, that you're this person. If you have dreadlocks, they automatically think that you're Rasta. If you have curly hair that's dark, sometimes they stereotype you with that too. And there's just all these stereotypes, and it's just a very interesting perspective, and I really liked it. I ended up giving it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. It's a self-published work, and for being a self-published work, I really thought it was very well done. They had 5 sections in this book that covered love, lost, finding yourself, acceptance, and moving on. And so each one of these sections had an intro and an outro, and the first section's outro I felt was a little bit disjointed from the rest of the writing, and it didn't quite summarize well enough, I felt, for the rest of it, especially in the first section. The rest of the sections I felt flowed very well. They were very well done, and I definitely recommend this. I thought it was a very interesting read. It had a lot of interesting takeaways from it, and it was just a fun thing to read, and it definitely left an impression. So the next 2 books that I read is The Ancient Magnus Bride. I read books number 8 and 7. This is by Core Yamazaki, and these are mangas. These are actually YA mangas, which have a little bit of fantasy in it. You have this girl Chiz, who is considered a slave baggie, which she's kind of a battery for other people who can do magic, alchemists, and all that stuff, but it takes a lot out of her. She's actually quite old, even at 15, 16 years old, to still be alive, because this sleigh baggie business, it just drains you. Growing up, she never really has a place that she can call home. And this guy here, Elias, he actually buys her in an auction and takes her back to his place and gives her a home and support and teaches her things. And I love these stories. They are so cute and beautiful, and I really do enjoy these. I'm going to be continue on with it. They recently came out with book 9, and I really need to get it because I'm aching to see where that goes from there. I ended up rating volume 7 a 5 out of 5 stars and volume 8 a 4 out of 5 stars. The last book that I read is by Christina Lauren, Love in Other Words. This is told from the perspective of Macy. When Macy was young, she lost her mother, and so she only had her father. Her father and her mother were soulmates. They were very much in love. And before her mother died, she left her father with a list of things that he needed to remember to do so that Macy could still feel like her mother was a part of her life. One of those things was one weekend when she was feeling very tired, that he was to go out and take her away. Well, instead of just taking her away, he decides to buy a weekend house in California for them to go and hang out with, and it was just a nice summer house for them to go. Well, when they get there, they meet a boy named Elliot. And Elliot is this boy like that she ends up building a very strong bond with. This book is told from 2 different timelines in alternating chapters. You have the one timeline when she's younger and she loses her mother and she's going to the house as a neighbor to Elliot. And then you have her 11 years later when she's interning at the hospital to become a doctor in the pediatric area. Well, something happens between the ending of the first timeline and the beginning of the second that brings them back together again, and because they had a falling out, and Elliot is just so relieved to see her that he ends up really wanting to get to know her. Well, at this point, she is, as an adult, she is already engaged. I really enjoyed the vast majority of this book. I had me blushing and giggling and everything else, like all the girly stuff, and I really liked it. But most romance books, at one point or another, the guy ends up making me so angry. And I felt very angry towards the end of this book because of things that happened. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I was very angry with him. And that was such a shame because I honestly was headed towards giving this a 5 stars, but then that happened and I kind of feel like with romance books, if you read a romance book, you should fall in love with the person that they're in love with, at least a little bit. And it just kind of ruined the whole mood for me towards the end, you know? It was just kind of a mood ruiner. So I ended up giving this a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Overall, it was a good book, and I liked all of the things in it. I liked the tropey romance, and it was just really cute, but the ending didn't really do it for me. All right, guys, that is it. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, hit the little like, hit subscribe, and make sure you hit the little bell icon to receive emails every time I post, and I will see you again very soon.